The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Michael Jordan took his seat at the defendant's table, his expression calm and unreadable. It was an unusual sight. Jordan, the basketball legend, known for his dominance on the court, now found himself in a completely different kind of battle, one that didn't involve a hoop or a buzzer beater but rather legal arguments and courtroom strategy. The lawsuit against him stemmed from a complex business dispute, one that many legal analysts had predicted could tarnish his reputation if he lost. His opposition, a group of high-profile attorneys representing a corporate entity, believed they had the upper hand. After all, Jordan was an athlete, not a lawyer. What did he know about the intricate world of litigation? The opposing counsel smirked as they glanced in his direction, clearly expecting an easy win. Even the judge, a well-respected but notoriously condescending figure, seemed to have already formed an opinion about Jordan's intellectual capacity. As the judge skimmed through the preliminary documents, he let out a light chuckle, shaking his head slightly. "Mr. Jordan," he began, peering over his glasses with a bemused expression, "I hope you have a strong legal team, because last I checked, being good at basketball doesn't mean you're good at understanding the law." A few people in the courtroom exchanged knowing glances, some even suppressing laughter. Jordan, however, didn't flinch. He simply adjusted his tie, his face betraying no emotion. The judge continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "I assume your legal counsel will be doing most of the talking today? Unless, of course, you plan on dazzling us with your knowledge of tort law." The courtroom erupted in soft chuckles, but Jordan remained composed. He had seen this kind of doubt before, on the court when people underestimated him, and off the court when he ventured into business. He knew exactly how to handle it. The plaintiff's lawyers took the judge's remarks as confirmation of their assumed advantage. They were up against an athlete, a man whose fame was built on physical prowess, not intellectual battles. But what they didn't realize was that Michael Jordan had been preparing for this case for months. He had read every legal document, studied every precedent, and consulted with some of the best legal minds in the country. He didn't just rely on his lawyers, he immersed himself in the case. As the plaintiff's lead attorney rose to present their case, Jordan leaned back, listening carefully, analyzing every word, every argument, every assumption. The lawyer painted Jordan as a reckless businessman, someone who had made a bad deal and was now trying to weasel out of it. The words were sharp, carefully crafted to cast doubt on Jordan's integrity. But what truly caught Jordan's attention was how the judge responded. With each argument against him, the judge nodded approvingly, occasionally glancing in Jordan's direction as if expecting him to crumble under the weight of legal jargon. Jordan knew this wasn't just about the case. This was about perception. The judge, like so many others, saw him as a mere athlete, incapable of holding his own in such an intellectual arena. Jordan smirked to himself. He had faced tougher opponents on the court. If they thought he was going to sit quietly and let them walk all over him, they were about to be in for a very rude awakening. The courtroom settled into a quiet hum as the judge adjusted his glasses and glanced over the legal documents in front of him, shaking his head slightly. He sighed, then leaned forward with a smirk, clearly enjoying the moment more than he should have. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his tone laced with amusement, "I have to admit, I've presided over quite a few cases in my time, but this is the first time I've had a basketball player attempt to navigate legal matters as if he were an attorney." A few chuckles rippled through the room, particularly from the plaintiff's side. Jordan, however, remained stone-faced. His eyes locked onto the judge with the same intensity he had on the court during a Game 7. The judge continued, flipping through a few pages of the case file. "Now, I know you've made quite a name for yourself in business, but let's be honest, negotiating sneaker deals and endorsements is quite different from arguing case law. I assume you're leaving the heavy lifting to your legal team." He raised an eyebrow, waiting for a reaction. Jordan merely adjusted his tie and remained silent. Sensing an opportunity to further cement his authority, the judge leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers together. "You know, I've seen this kind of thing before," he mused, looking out at the courtroom as if addressing an audience at a comedy club. Celebrities, athletes, even musicians. People who think that just because they've had success in one field, they can walk into a courtroom and suddenly become legal scholars. He let out a short chuckle. "The law doesn't work that way. We don't hand out victories just because you're famous." The laughter from the opposing legal team grew a little louder, emboldened by the judge's words. Jordan's own attorneys exchanged uneasy glances, clearly aware that the judge's bias was seeping into the proceedings. But Jordan himself? He didn't move. His face remained unreadable, betraying nothing. The plaintiff's lead attorney, encouraged by the judge's mocking tone, decided to pile on. "Your Honor, I completely agree," he said, smirking. "We respect Mr. Jordan's contributions to the world of sports, but this is a legal matter, and quite frankly, I don't think a jump shot is going to help him here." More laughter. The judge nodded approvingly, then turned back to Jordan. "Tell me, Mr. Jordan, just out of curiosity, how much do you actually know about contract law?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Can you tell me the key differences between unilateral and bilateral contracts? Or perhaps you'd like to enlighten us on the intricacies of tortious interference." The courtroom hushed, all eyes turning to Jordan. A normal person might have stumbled, gotten defensive, or even lashed out at the blatant disrespect. But Jordan... He simply sat forward, slowly and deliberately, his expression unchanged. The judge's smirk faltered just slightly. Jordan clasped his hands together, exhaling as if he had been waiting for this moment. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even annoyed. If anything, he looked almost amused. The judge, now slightly unsettled by Jordan's unwavering gaze, cleared his throat and looked back at the case file. "Look, I don't mean to belittle your intelligence, Mr. Jordan," he said, though the smirk never fully left his face. "I just think we should keep expectations realistic. This is a complex case, after all. I wouldn't want you to embarrass yourself by trying to argue points that are, how should I say this, outside of your expertise." The plaintiff's lawyers nodded along, but they weren't prepared for what was about to happen next. Because while they had spent the last 20 minutes laughing at Jordan, underestimating him, and treating him like an unqualified amateur in a world he didn't belong in, they had no idea that they had just handed him the exact opportunity he wanted. A slow smile crept onto Jordan's face, and for the first time, he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, confident, and sharp as a knife. "Since you seem so interested in my legal knowledge, why don't I answer your question about unilateral and bilateral contracts?" The judge blinked, slightly caught off guard. Jordan leaned forward just slightly, his eyes never leaving the judge's. A unilateral contract is one where a party makes a promise in exchange for a specific action. Think of it like a bounty. A bilateral contract, on the other hand, involves two parties exchanging promises with mutual obligations. The courtroom fell silent. Jordan continued, his voice steady. "And as for tortious interference, that occurs when a third party intentionally disrupts an existing contract or business relationship, leading to damages. It's a common issue in high-level business negotiations, particularly when competitors attempt to undermine existing agreements for their own benefit." The judge's smirk had vanished. The plaintiff's attorneys shifted uncomfortably. Jordan exhaled, leaning back slightly. "I'm not a lawyer, Your Honor," he said, "but I do my homework." For the first time since the trial began, the judge had nothing to say. The arrogance had drained from his face, replaced with something closer to quiet shock. Jordan had done more than answer his question. He had done so with the precision of someone who had spent years in legal study. The courtroom, which had moments ago been filled with chuckles and whispers, was now eerily silent. Jordan hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't shown the slightest hint of aggression. He had simply dismantled the judge's entire assumption in under a minute. The judge cleared his throat, clearly trying to recover. "Well, I see you've been doing some reading," he muttered, flipping through his papers to avoid making eye contact. But everyone in the room knew what had just happened. Jordan had turned the judge's own arrogance against him. The plaintiff's attorneys, once so confident in their easy victory, now looked unsettled. And Jordan... He just smiled to himself. He had seen this play out before, people doubting him, underestimating him, and thinking he didn't belong. But just like on the court, he thrived on it. This was only the beginning. The weight of Jordan's words still lingered in the air, hanging over the courtroom like the final seconds of a tied championship game. The judge, once smug and dismissive, now found himself shifting in his seat, his expression tight with an unease he could no longer mask. The opposing attorneys, who had moments ago reveled in the judge's mockery of Jordan, now whispered among themselves, their confidence visibly shaken. It wasn't just that Jordan had answered the judge's legal questions, it was how he did it. He didn't just repeat memorized definitions. He spoke with clarity, understanding, and conviction. It was the tone of a man who didn't just learn information but mastered it. And as Jordan sat back, his posture relaxed yet authoritative, the realization began to dawn on everyone present. This was no ordinary defendant. Jordan let a moment of silence stretch, controlling the tempo of the room as if he were pacing the flow of a game. He didn't need to rush. He had them exactly where he wanted them. Then, with the same composed confidence, he turned his attention to the plaintiff's attorneys. "Now that we've established that I understand contract law," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate, "let's talk about the case." His legal team, initially prepared to do most of the talking, sat frozen in their seats, watching their client take full control of the narrative. The plaintiff's lead attorney, a seasoned litigator who had built his career on dismantling corporate opponents, straightened his tie, trying to recover his confidence. "Mr. Jordan," he began, forcing a smirk, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm, I think we should leave the legal arguments to the professionals." Jordan tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the remark. "That's exactly what I intend to do," he replied smoothly. "But I've noticed something interesting. Your entire case is built on the assumption that I negligently breached a contractual agreement. But there's just one problem." He leaned forward, locking eyes with the attorney. "That contract was never valid to begin with." The attorney blinked. "Excuse me," he said, his voice losing its earlier arrogance. Jordan turned to the judge, his confidence unwavering. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to the formation of this so-called agreement." According to contract law, he let that phrase hang for just a second, subtly reminding the judge of their earlier exchange. A contract requires mutual assent, clear terms, and lawful consideration. But if you look closely at the details of this case, you'll notice something interesting. He reached for a stack of neatly organized documents his attorneys had prepared, flipping through them with an ease that stunned everyone watching. "This contract," he continued, holding up a page, "contains an ambiguity so significant that it negates mutual assent entirely." He slid the document toward the judge. "The language here states that my company was expected to engage in certain negotiations but does not provide a definitive obligation, nor a legally enforceable commitment. That means this isn't a binding contract, it's a vague understanding at best." The judge, now fully engaged in the argument, furrowed his brow and read the passage Jordan had pointed out. The room was silent except for the occasional rustling of paper as he analyzed the text. The plaintiff's attorneys scrambled through their notes, trying to find a counterargument. Jordan sat back, allowing them to process what had just happened. The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Jordan," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that this case hinges on the lack of enforceable obligation?" Jordan nodded. "Exactly, Your Honor. The plaintiff's entire argument rests on a breach of contract. But if there's no legally binding contract to begin with, then there's nothing to breach. Their case collapses under its own weight." He turned toward the opposing counsel, his expression unshaken. "And I'm guessing they knew that, which is why they were so eager to paint me as an uninformed defendant rather than debate the actual law." A low murmur spread through the courtroom. The opposing attorneys were visibly flustered, flipping through their notes as if searching for a lifeline. The lead attorney finally spoke, his voice less steady than before. "Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to review these new claims." But the judge, now fully aware of what was unfolding, shook his head. "No," he said, his tone suddenly sharp and authoritative. "You've had ample time to prepare your argument. Mr. Jordan just presented a well-reasoned legal defense that directly challenges your case's foundation. If you weren't prepared for this, that's not his problem, it's yours." The plaintiff's attorney clenched his jaw, realizing too late that the courtroom had shifted in Jordan's favor. What was supposed to be an easy win had turned into something else entirely, a battle they weren't sure they could win. And worst of all, they had underestimated their opponent. Jordan, sensing his advantage, pressed forward. "Your Honor, I'd also like to address another critical point," he said, his voice even. Not only is the contract in question non-binding, but the plaintiff's claims of damages are based on speculative losses rather than concrete harm. He gestured toward another set of documents. They argue that my actions led to a loss of projected revenue, but as legal precedent has shown, hypothetical damages cannot serve as a basis for compensation unless proven with reasonable certainty. The judge glanced at the documents Jordan referenced, his lips pressing together. It was clear he wasn't just impressed, he was shaken. Jordan hadn't just defended himself. He had taken the plaintiff's case apart piece by piece. What had started as a mockery, a public spectacle meant to humiliate him, had now become a reckoning for everyone who had doubted him. The opposing attorneys were out of counter-arguments. They had walked into court expecting to exploit a clueless athlete. Instead, they found themselves face to face with a man who had prepared for this moment with the same meticulous precision he had used to dismantle opponents in the NBA. The judge, who had so gleefully mocked Jordan earlier, was now quiet, staring at the documents before him as if trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened. Jordan sat back, his expression calm. He had done what he always did, studied the opposition, found their weaknesses, and struck with unrelenting precision. The game wasn't over yet, but the momentum had shifted. And now, everyone in the courtroom knew one undeniable truth. Michael Jordan wasn't just a legend on the court, he was a force to be reckoned with in any arena he stepped into. A thick silence hung over the courtroom, the kind that settles in after a game-winning shot is made and the opposing team realizes they've lost. The lead attorney for the plaintiff, once brimming with confidence, now stared down at his notes, flipping through pages as if salvation might be hiding somewhere between the lines. The judge, who had begun the proceedings with condescension and mockery, now looked unsettled, his once arrogant smirk replaced by a furrowed brow and pursed lips. The power dynamic in the room had shifted, and it had happened so quickly that most didn't even realize it until now. Michael Jordan, the man they had written off as a mere athlete, had systematically dismantled an entire case in front of their eyes. And he wasn't done yet. Jordan exhaled slowly, his confidence unwavering, his movements precise. He had seen this before, not in a courtroom, but in every high-stakes game he had ever played. The moment where doubt creeps into the minds of his opponents, the moment they start questioning everything they thought they knew. He had them exactly where he wanted them. His legal team, who had initially been ready to lead the charge, now sat back in stunned silence, watching as their client conducted his own masterclass in legal strategy. The judge, clearly trying to reassert control over the situation, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice slightly more measured than before, "while your argument regarding the non-binding nature of the contract is intriguing, I would still like to hear from opposing counsel on this matter." He turned toward the plaintiff's attorneys, who were visibly scrambling to find a response. "Counsel, do you have a rebuttal?" The lead attorney stood up, straightening his jacket, his movements deliberate but betraying a slight hesitation. He was a veteran in the courtroom, but this was the first time he had found himself in a legal battle against someone who wasn't even a lawyer. Worse, he had underestimated his opponent, and now, with all eyes on him, he realized he had no easy path forward. He cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Your Honor, while Mr. Jordan has certainly educated himself on certain aspects of contract law, we maintain that the agreement in question did, in fact, contain enforceable terms." Jordan tilted his head slightly, as if challenging the attorney to continue. The lead counsel shuffled his notes and pressed forward. The plaintiff entered into negotiations with Mr. Jordan's company in good faith, with the expectation of a finalized agreement, he argued. While Mr. Jordan claims there was ambiguity, we assert that the intention to form a contract was clear, and therefore, he is still liable for damages resulting from the failure to execute the agreement. Jordan leaned forward slightly, lacing his fingers together, his voice calm but sharp. "So you're arguing that intent alone is enough to create a binding contract?" he asked. "Even in the absence of clearly defined obligations?" The attorney hesitated. "I'm arguing that." Jordan didn't let him finish. Because if that were true, then every handshake agreement, every informal business discussion, could be legally enforced, which isn't how contract law works. He gestured toward the judge. "Your Honor, the law requires a meeting of the minds. Both parties must agree to specific, enforceable terms. Without that, there's no contract. Just expectations." The judge leaned back in his chair, nodding slightly, the gears turning in his mind. The plaintiff's attorney, realizing he had been backed into another corner, tried again. Even if we assume that ambiguity existed in the initial contract, Mr. Jordan's actions following the negotiations indicated an acceptance of the agreement. Jordan smirked, the kind of smirk he used when he knew he had an opponent beat. "Ah," he said, tapping his fingers lightly against the table. "So now you're pivoting to implied acceptance?" He glanced at the judge, then back at the attorney. "Let's say for argument's sake that I did act in a way that suggested I was moving forward with the agreement. That still doesn't override the fact that the contract itself was not legally binding. You can't enforce an implication. Either there was a contract, or there wasn't." The attorney was visibly flustered now, his argument unraveling with every sentence Jordan spoke. The judge, once so dismissive of Jordan's presence in the courtroom, now looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, part curiosity, part reluctant admiration. And then, as if sealing the fate of the case, Jordan delivered the final blow. "Let's take this a step further," he said, flipping through his own documents before pulling out a page and sliding it toward his attorneys. "Your Honor, I'd like to introduce this into evidence." The judge raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Jordan's smirk widened just slightly. "A precedent," he said simply. "A case remarkably similar to this one, in which a court ruled that an agreement lacking clear obligations and enforceable terms was not, in fact, a valid contract." The judge glanced at the document, his eyes scanning the ruling, and his expression shifted again. This time, it wasn't just reluctant admiration, it was something closer to genuine respect. The opposing attorney knew it was over. He could fight it, try to drag out the argument, but he saw it in the judge's face. Jordan had done what few could do, completely flipped the case on its head. The courtroom had gone from viewing him as a clueless celebrity to recognizing him as a strategic mastermind. The judge finally set the document down, exhaling slowly. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice carrying a different weight now, "I have to say, I did not expect this." Jordan leaned back in his chair, adjusting his suit. "I've made a career out of exceeding expectations," he said simply. The courtroom chuckled, not in mockery, but in recognition. The judge nodded slowly, finally acknowledging what had become evident to everyone in the room. "It would seem you have." The plaintiff's attorneys knew they had lost. The case, once a surefire victory in their eyes, was now crumbling, and they were quickly running out of arguments. But Jordan wasn't just focused on winning, he was about to prove a much bigger point. And as the judge called for a recess to deliberate, it was clear that the tide had turned completely. The game wasn't over yet, but Michael Jordan was in control. As the judge called for a brief recess, the tension in the room remained thick. Lawyers murmured among themselves, the courtroom spectators exchanged knowing glances, and the plaintiff's team huddled together like a defeated squad trying to regroup at halftime. The judge, who had started the day mocking Michael Jordan, now sat with his hands clasped, staring at the legal precedent Jordan had just introduced. The arrogance in his demeanor had dissipated. In its place was something unexpected: admiration. The courtroom emptied slightly as people stepped out to stretch and process what had just happened, but Jordan remained seated, cool and composed, watching as the opposing attorneys whispered furiously to one another. His own legal team, who had prepared for this case thinking they'd be the ones doing the heavy lifting, looked at him in stunned silence. They weren't just impressed, they were in awe. One of his attorneys finally broke the silence. "Mr. Jordan, where did you learn all this?" Jordan smirked slightly, still relaxed. "I learn from my opponents," he said. "Always have." When the judge returned to his seat and signaled for court to reconvene, his expression had changed. He no longer looked at Jordan as just another high-profile defendant. He saw him as an equal, maybe even as a superior in that moment. And the shift in his attitude was obvious to everyone in the room. He cleared his throat and adjusted his robe, his tone far more measured than before. "Mr. Jordan," he said, pausing slightly, as if carefully choosing his next words, "I must admit, I initially misjudged you." Jordan raised an eyebrow, staying silent, allowing the judge to continue. "When this case was first presented, I assumed you would rely entirely on your legal team to navigate these proceedings," the judge admitted. And, to be perfectly candid, I expected you to be—" He stopped himself, choosing his words carefully. "Less prepared." There were no gasps in the courtroom, no dramatic reactions, but the weight of the judge's admission was felt by everyone. This wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about proving something bigger, that intelligence, strategy, and preparation aren't confined to a single profession. Jordan nodded slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "underestimation has always been my greatest advantage." The judge chuckled softly, shaking his head. "So I see." He shifted his gaze toward the plaintiff's attorneys, who sat stiffly, knowing they had lost their upper hand. "Now then, before we move forward, I'd like to hear from opposing counsel. Do you wish to contest Mr. Jordan's argument further, or shall we proceed with a ruling?" The lead plaintiff's attorney, who had spent the last several minutes frantically scribbling notes and whispering to his colleagues, finally stood. He was clearly rattled, but he forced a professional smile. "Your Honor," he began, but his voice lacked the confidence it once had. "We believe that despite the compelling points made by Mr. Jordan, there are still elements of our case that warrant further examination." Jordan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He had heard this kind of talk before. It was the legal equivalent of a team stalling for time. The judge, however, was not in the mood for stalling. He glanced down at the documents in front of him, tapping his fingers lightly against the desk before speaking. "Counsel," he said, his tone firmer now, "you came into this courtroom with the expectation of an easy victory. I suspect you believed this case would be decided based on influence rather than merit. Am I wrong?" The plaintiff's attorney froze for just a fraction of a second before regaining his composure. "Your Honor, we—" The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "No, let's not dance around it. I've been in this profession long enough to recognize when a party believes they have the upper hand before the trial even begins. You underestimated Mr. Jordan, and now you find yourselves unprepared to refute his claims." The opposing attorneys sat in silence. They knew arguing would only make matters worse. The judge exhaled sharply, flipping through the case files once more before finally setting them aside. "I am inclined to agree with Mr. Jordan's assessment of the contract. The lack of specific obligations and the ambiguous nature of the terms raise significant concerns regarding enforceability. Based on the evidence presented, I find it difficult to justify proceeding with the plaintiff's claims as they currently stand." A hushed murmur spread through the courtroom. This wasn't just a small win for Jordan. This was a near-total collapse of the plaintiff's case. Jordan remained composed, though inside, he recognized this moment for what it was, a turning point. He had not only changed the course of the case, but also the perception of himself in that courtroom. The judge straightened in his seat, looking at Jordan once more. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice carrying an unusual weight, "I'll admit, I never expected to say this, but your argument was one of the most well-structured defenses I have seen from someone without formal legal training." Jordan allowed a small smile. "I take pride in my preparation, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "That is evident." He turned back to the plaintiff's table. "Now, counsel, I'll give you one final opportunity. Do you have any substantial counterarguments to present, or will you concede that the contract in question lacks enforceability?" The lead attorney shifted uncomfortably. He knew there was no winning this. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quieter now, "we respectfully request a reconsideration of the claims before moving forward." In other words, they wanted to retreat and find a new angle, anything to salvage the case. But everyone in that courtroom knew the truth. The game had already been won. The judge sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Very well," he said. "But I strongly advise you to consider whether pursuing this case further is truly in your client's best interest." The opposing counsel nodded stiffly, knowing the damage had been done. They had underestimated their opponent, and now they were paying the price. Jordan sat back, calm and composed, his expression unreadable. But inside, he knew exactly what had happened. The judge, once dismissive and mocking, had come full circle. He no longer saw Jordan as just an athlete, just a businessman, just a celebrity. He saw him for what he truly was, a man who dominated in every arena he stepped into. And this game, like so many before it, was now firmly in his hands. The courtroom was still. The weight of what had just transpired hung in the air, pressing down on the plaintiff's legal team like a suffocating defense in the final seconds of a championship game. Michael Jordan had not only defended himself with stunning precision, but he had also forced the judge, once a skeptic, into an undeniable position of respect. The opposing attorneys, who had started the case with arrogance and certainty, now sat stiffly, their confidence eroded. They knew what was coming. The judge knew what was coming. And Jordan, he had known it all along. The judge inhaled deeply before adjusting his glasses, his gaze sweeping across the room. His demeanor was entirely different now, measured, serious, and, for the first time that day, deferential toward Jordan. He tapped his gavel lightly against the desk before speaking. After reviewing the arguments presented and carefully considering the applicable laws, I find that the contract in question does not meet the legal standards necessary for enforcement. As such, I am ruling in favor of the defendant, Mr. Jordan. The words were like a buzzer beater sinking through the net. The courtroom erupted into a mixture of murmurs and suppressed gasps. It was over. The plaintiff's attorneys sat frozen, unable to hide their frustration. They had banked on an easy win, believing that their legal maneuvering and courtroom clout would overpower Jordan's lack of formal legal training. But they had been wrong. So very wrong. Jordan remained composed, but the subtle gleam in his eye told the real story. This wasn't just about winning a case. It was about proving, once again, that he was a master strategist, on the court, in business, and now, in the courtroom. The judge, perhaps realizing the significance of the moment, leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Jordan," he said, his voice carrying a different tone than before, one that held not just respect but something deeper, genuine intrigue. "I must say, in all my years presiding over legal disputes, I have never encountered a non-lawyer who argued their own case with such skill." Jordan gave a small nod. "Your Honor, I've spent my life studying competition," he said simply. "It doesn't matter if it's basketball, business, or law. If you understand strategy, if you prepare, you can win anywhere." The judge let out a small chuckle, shaking his head in reluctant admiration. "It would appear you are correct." As the courtroom began to settle, Jordan's attorneys finally allowed themselves to breathe, exchanging impressed glances. They had been prepared to defend him, but in the end, all they had to do was sit back and watch. It was a rare thing to witness. Michael Jordan, the competitor, applying his mind as sharply as his athletic prowess, leaving everyone in stunned silence. The plaintiff's team, still reeling, quickly huddled together, whispering in hushed tones. They had lost. Badly. But now, the question was whether they had the stomach to appeal. Sensing their hesitation, Jordan turned to face them directly. His voice was calm, yet cutting. "You can appeal if you want," he said, his tone almost casual. "But I'd advise against it." The lead plaintiff's attorney stiffened. "And why is that?" Jordan leaned forward slightly, his gaze locked onto them. "Because I'll be even more prepared next time." A long silence followed. The attorney swallowed hard. He knew Jordan wasn't bluffing. This wasn't a man who let himself get beat, ever. Appealing would only mean walking back into another defeat, and this time, it could be even worse. Realizing their options were rapidly dwindling, the plaintiff's team slowly stood, gathering their documents. The lead attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice barely concealing his frustration, "we respect the court's decision and will consider our next steps accordingly." The judge raised an eyebrow, recognizing the attempt to save face. "Very well," he said simply, signaling for court adjournment. He lifted his gavel and struck it down. "Court is dismissed." And just like that, it was over. Jordan rose from his seat, buttoning his suit jacket with the same quiet confidence he had always carried. He shook hands with his legal team, acknowledging their efforts, but everyone in the room knew the truth. This victory had been entirely his. As he turned to leave, the judge called out one last time, "Mr. Jordan." Jordan paused, glancing back. The judge studied him for a long moment before speaking. "If you ever decide to switch careers, the legal world could use someone like you." Jordan smirked. "I'll stick to winning where it matters." And with that, he walked out of the courtroom, leaving behind yet another arena where his legend had been cemented.